Now we are. Good evening, everyone. We're working our way through the very last pages of Swami's wonderful book, In Divine Friendship. I hope you have enjoyed this course as much as I have. It's been just delightful to spend all this time with Swami. So, Keshav is going to chant, but before he does, we will pray. Not pray for his chant, but we will pray anyway. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your living presence in every part of our consciousness, that we may move in this world in constant remembrance that we are here by your grace to serve your cause, to be instruments of your light, to help in every way possible, to uplift and to enlighten. Guide us and bless us that we may serve you well. Om. Peace. Amen.
Om temple of my heart. God of beauty is now reigning in the temple of my heart. God of beauty is now reigning in the temple of my heart, of my heart, of my heart, in the temple of my heart, of my heart, of my heart, in the temple of my heart. God of beauty is now reigning in the temple of my heart. God of beauty is now reigning in the temple of my heart, of my heart, of my heart, in the temple of my heart, of my heart, of my heart, in the temple of my heart. God of beauty is now reigning in the temple of my heart. God of beauty is now reigning in the temple of my heart, of my heart, of my heart, in the temple of my heart, of my heart, of my heart, in the temple of my heart, of my heart, of my heart, in the temple of
Om peace. Amen. Okay, my friends. We are now in the section of the book called Suffering and Death, which has actually proved to be really a marvelously inspiring call to renunciation and to put our lives in order. So we were in the middle of a letter. It was just too long for me to, and the letter was from 1991, and the subject was on humility and grace. And he was talking to someone who has had a recurrence of cancer and has had to take another round of chemotherapy, and it's been very difficult. And excuse me. No, that letter was finished. This letter is from October 31st, 2006. Let's see. And this is also someone who's very ill. A serious illness can be a great blessing. So Swami is saying to her, I think this is a female, but I'm not sure. Don't think of your body as your own. It is God's body, from which at least the consciousness of illness must be banished. And I think I talked a little bit last time about how Master says, even up to the point of dying, don't ever identify yourself with your illness. Through this sincere, courageous effort, think always of becoming a Jivan Mukta in this life, freed from all identity with body, personality, and ego, with anything, in other words, that defines you as a separate human entity, rather than solely as a manifestation of God. You see, I've never had any kind of serious physical trouble. This body that I live in operates extremely well. I've never had a serious illness. I've never had an operation. I've never spent the night in the hospital. I've certainly never had a terminal diagnosis. I say all that as a caveat because I really don't know what that feels like. I've been very impressed watching my yogi friends. By now, when I look at pictures through the decades, I see how many people have died. So a lot of my yogi friends have had to face into all of these conditions and really put the teachings to the test in this way. So my comment about this is just what I would think it would be like, what I think the possibility could be of just knowing that this body's just not going to stay with me, that it has this, it has this termination date, which of course all bodies do, but now you're right there. You know what illness you have. When Swami says and Master says resist, he doesn't mean, and I believe I said this last time, he doesn't mean to pretend that you're not dying. It's much more gracious for yourself and for everyone if you can put forward the possibility that this body may not last. But if we can deeply and profoundly separate ourselves from feeling that just because the body is not going to last, and I know this may sound funny, that it has anything actually to do with me. And this is what the people tell me, my friends tell me, when their bodies really begin to depart. And when you really know, I know when my friend Tushti was dying, at one point her legs no longer responded to her will. And even to move her at that point, she was still getting out of bed to go into the bathroom. But we had to put her into a wheelchair and move her into the bathroom in a wheelchair. And I remember she said to me, "What's wrong with my legs?" I said, "Tushti, you're dying." And she said, "Oh yeah, oh yeah, that's right. That's why my legs aren't responding anymore, because the life force is withdrawing and the body's not going to work the same way." I mean, we're so accustomed that I send the energy to my hand and my hand moves. But as we begin to die, I know from being with dying people, not in this incarnation, obviously, or even being threatened like that. But I remember one of my friends was in the last days of her life, and she was lying on the pillow and her head was at a very difficult angle. And one of her friends said, "Don't you want to move your head to a more comfortable position?" And I vividly remember she said, "You have no idea how much willpower it would take for me to move my head." Those of us who just live in our bodies normally, we don't think about that. But there was so little life force left in her that just the body just assumed a position, and the capacity of the mind to redirect it was just so diminished. Now we can either panic or feel bereft or afraid when that happens, or we can say, "I'm going to be a Jivan Mukta." What that means is, whatever karma there is left, let it just burn through this body so that I can be free forever. And that's a wonderful way to deal with all karma that comes. It's just like, I'm just burning this out so I can be free. And so whatever comes then, we're in the light. That's what I talked about last time. We're with God, we're in the light, we're observing what goes on. We're not bound by what goes on, even with something we consider so intimate as our own body. My happy give it all back to God before you go to sleep exercise works the best when I think of myself as actually, perhaps I'm going to leave my body, I'm going to die tonight. Because I've seen that enacted, and I sort of know what the bhav of that is. To just, even as you lie down to go to sleep, just pull your consciousness way out from this world and try to observe this incarnation as one of hundreds of thousands that we've had. How many births and deaths, how many youths and old age. It's exceedingly hard to cognize how incidental this particular incarnation is, meaning in the great stream of things. that I have always been present, but I has worn so many costumes. Why cling to this one? As he says, through this sincere, courageous effort. Isn't that a beautiful phrase? Sincere and courageous. Think always of becoming a Jivan Mukta in this life, freed from all identity with body, personality, and ego, with anything, in other words, that defines you as a separate human entity rather than solely as a manifestation of God. That's the 2 points. A separate human entity or just a simple manifestation of God. I have felt more spiritual maturity growing in you. Be strong in Him. Remember, giving your ego to God doesn't mean becoming a non-entity. What happens is that the more you not only step out of the way mentally, but offer every thought, feeling, and action to God, the more you feel increasingly blessed by an ever stronger flow of His love, joy, and inspiration pouring through you. The Swamiji is really talking about himself, because Swamiji was so deeply identified with Master. He said, my consciousness is so united with Master that I can't tell where I end and he begins. And that's really quite a statement, isn't it? I can't tell where there is a separate Kriyananda from Yogananda. We've just become so much one reality. But, he says, the more you step out of the way mental, giving your ego to God doesn't mean you become a non-entity. I mean, Swami Kriyananda was the absolute opposite of a non-entity. He was vibrant, he was enthusiastic, he was original, he was stunningly creative, he was so productive. He had such a distinctive and marked presence in any context that he moved in. I mean, he was the opposite of a non-entity. But it wasn't an egoic personality. It was an open doorway for the divine to shine through. And when we're an open doorway for the divine to shine, the divine does indeed shine. And when we're willing instruments, then God inspires us to endless creativity and actions and loving expressions, and just so much is able to come through us. I had an interesting experience from when I was 18 that manifested, that sort of the understanding finished when I was in my 20s. In the family that I grew up in, we weren't arguers. Well, my brother was a debater, and so we had intellectual discussions that we would argue our points. But in terms of our personal feelings about things, we didn't fight with each other very much. When I think about it, actually, we were a pretty, if not harmonious, we were a pretty harmonious family. And I started to say no, but yeah, I think we were a pretty harmonious family. We didn't fight a lot. The 3 siblings, my sister and brother and I don't really hardly ever remember fighting. I can't remember fighting. Although my brother was feisty and he would tease us, my sister and I, he was the oldest, and sometimes we'd get upset about that. And I would have my own personal upsets, but I don't remember it being fighting. I don't remember fighting with my parents, and my parents never fought in front of the children. They may have had their disagreements, but they were always kept it, they didn't display it to the children. So as a consequence, I grew up with a person who, if you ever really raised your voice in anger, it was a hugely serious thing. It wasn't just like an everyday occurrence like it is in some families, or just exuberant that way. But I realized that the more or less peaceable personality that I presented was not really sincere. It was based on a tremendous fear of conflict. Conflict frightened me on a very deep level. And then I was 19 years old at this point, and I went to spend the summer in New York City with friends. And we were all just getting onto the spiritual path, really just learning about self-realization and everything that it involved. And I began to realize that it wasn't the appearance you gave to the world that mattered. It was what the inner motivation was, what our real consciousness is. Not the costume we put on that consciousness, but what the real consciousness was. And so I had this seemingly peaceable personality, but it wasn't based on freedom. It was based on fear. So the real consciousness I was manifesting was fear. And I was beginning to learn that was a really terrible idea. So I decided I really just needed to learn to stand up for myself, to speak my opinions, to be strong in just ordinary human ways. New York City is a perfect place for a California girl to learn this, because they are so rough and tumble there, and people just speak their mind, and they just behave very differently than we do in San Francisco. So for me to be able to just be assertive, and I mean, I was assertive in ways like I didn't yet have the nerve to really assert it in other parts of my life where I should have, but I was able to assert it mostly with strangers. You go to the store, people elbow you out of the way, you're looking at something that you want to buy and somebody snatches it from you. The grocer, just puts his thumb on the scale to see if he can get away with it, to charge you a little bit more. And and just in the way of things there, people would just push each other out of the way. It was very good-natured. Tell the clerk to get his thumb off the scale. Nice try, buddy, but it's not going to work for me. And everybody would just laugh and go on. In my world, that kind of interaction was just life-threatening, and I had to work super hard to just get really comfortable. And actually what happened was I began to enjoy it. I began to enjoy being a little rude and a little aggressive and self-assertive and getting my way. And I realized that that wasn't really my goal. My goal was to just be unafraid when the situation required it, to speak frankly and be sincere. I can't say that I became great at it. I mean, it's been a lifelong reality, as it is for all of us, to really stand in truth and not be intimidated by others' opinions. So that was a whole cycle, which was an extremely important fundamental learning for me, which is the difference between appearances and inner reality. So many years later, I'm working. By now I've moved to Ananda. I've joined the monastery there. At this point I was helping. It would have been the summer of 1977. I was helping to publish Swami's book, The Path. He had gone on a long trip around the world. He was in seclusion in India, and the responsibility for going from the manuscript to the published book was left to a team of mostly women, the women monastics, and I was coordinating that effort. There was one girl on that team, great friend of mine. I absolutely love her. She's a Scorpio. Scorpios are, when they feel threatened, they sting. And she was very sharp-tongued. She grew up completely the opposite from me. She grew up with several sisters, and everybody screamed and yelled at each other just pretty continuously. A day without that was a very unusual day in her family. She was completely at ease with just expressing her mind, and the preemptive strike was her way of going at life. So she was in the middle of this project. I was in the middle of this project, and there was a lot of pressure. We were working literally as many hours as we could. Because we had a deadline to meet, and it was a lot. And she was getting a little agitated and starting to be very aggressive, and I wanted her to do something. She got really aggressive with me. She was snapping at the people, the other people around us, and this thought came to me: she needs to fight with someone. It's just like her temperament is such that she just needs to have an argument. And I sort of looked around and I thought, well, I'd probably be the best person to argue with her because I love her unconditionally and it won't make any difference to me. So we were in what is now Hansa Temple, but it was the publications building then, and there was a basement in a store like this through an open stairwell, and I think she was at the bottom and I was at the top. And we just started to fight. She started escalating and talking louder, and she didn't curse or anything like that. In those days, we didn't do that. But she just started being aggressive and rather insulting, so I started being aggressive and rather insulting, and she got a little louder, and I got a little louder. We're doing this right in the middle of the building so everybody can hear us. We sort of went up to the top of whatever it was we were screaming about. I don't even remember. We crested. I could see that she felt a lot better, and so then we came back down from it and just went about our work. First of all, I thought to myself, wow, Asha, you are great. Look at you, just standing there in the middle of a public place, just yelling. You never would have been able to do that before. Odd, isn't it? But you would never have been able to do that before. And then this is the part that was so sweet to me. And this is the whole reason I'm telling this story. Master needed someone to fight with her. And I say, Master, whatever you want me to do, I'm happy to do it. But of course, he can only use me if I'm able to do it. And I realized that all of those psychological kinks, of which there were still many and still are, fewer, but they still are, all those psychological kinks where the hose is knotted up and energy may need to flow in a certain way, but it can't. It can't flow through me or you or whatever because there's a kink. Energy is needed. Someone is needed who could do X, but I'm sorry, sir, I can't because I'm clinging to this and I'm afraid of that and I don't want to do this. And so when you become, as Swami is suggesting here, the more you not only get out of the way mentally, but offer your every thought, feeling, and action to God, the more you feel increasingly blessed by an ever stronger flow of His love, joy, and inspirations pouring through you. And see, that's how it works together. We have to work. It's God's grace and it's His divine energy which flows through us, but we have to open up the channel. We have to unkink the hose. We have to face into our limitations and have the courage to surrender them. Just really surrender them. If this is what you need done, then this is what I'll do. Master told Swamiji, you have a great work to do. And at one point, Swami was, Master put him into teaching and lecturing. Swami said it took him 7 years before he realized that it was a helpful thing to do, to talk and lecture to people. He didn't feel that was really, he just didn't want to do it. That's the only thing. I'm trying to find other words for it. But then he became convinced that it was both his dharma and also helpful. And he wrote to Master at one point, Master, I don't want to be a public lecturer. Master said, well, it's what you have to do. You better learn to like it. I mean, that's how much sympathy he got. Like, so what? That's interesting. You don't feel to do it, so what? It's like, this is what you have to do, so learn to do it. The more we surrender every thought and feeling and intention to the Master, the more we are flooded with an ever stronger flow. Now, of course, Swamiji, when he first came to Mount Washington, they were building a building at the Hollywood Church, the India Center building, and all the monks were working. They had a professional contractor, but all the monks, the men, provided the labor. And so Swami's working on this building. He said he had absolutely no aptitude for that kind of work. He said every time he would hammer a nail, he would hit his hand 9 times before he'd finally hit the nail. At the end of the time when he was finally taken off the project, he said to the contractor, well, it's been wonderful. I've learned so much. And the contractor said, have you? It's like, I didn't see much of it. And so after some months, a master put Swamiji on answering the students' letters and being the examiner for the lessons and, that kind of work. And Swamiji said he was happy to do whatever his guru asked him, but his energy flowed more easily when he was given that kind of work instead of just merely physical work. So it's not like we shouldn't flow with our affinities, but we shouldn't protect our weaknesses either. We shouldn't define ourselves as, I'm this kind of person or that kind of person. You may be to a large extent, but our personalities, this is just a costume we wear for a period of time. And in one lifetime, only certain aspects of who we are can be expressed. We may have many other dimensions that just this circumstance doesn't bring it out of us. I mean, even just start with gender. If there was a woman friend of mine, and she's a very small woman. And when I first met her, when she first came to live at Ananda, she had this huge vehicle, this huge four-wheel drive vehicle, and she was maybe even a little smaller than I am. And I mean, I'm not tiny, but I'm not a big, strong-looking woman. She drove this truck, and she was so small. You know how it is sometimes when people's heads don't show up much over the steering wheel. And at one point, I said to her, essentially, "This is a ridiculous vehicle for you." And she sort of said, "I know, but it feels like the right one for me." And her personal explanation was that for many lifetimes she'd been a very big man, and she had become too reliant on physical strength. And this was her explanation, which made perfect sense to me. She'd just become too reliant on having all that physical power, and so she was transitioning, being a female, and then being a small female at that. But her self-image was still someone who would have a great big vehicle like this. So it's just sort of, she went out shopping and that was the one she wanted. So we don't know. Our personalities are just something we wear. I was talking to a friend about fear of death. And I mentioned that perhaps in this broadcast, I don't know which one. And he commented to me that as far as he knows, he doesn't have that much fear of death. But the explanation was interesting. He said he felt it's because he'd been a soldier so many lifetimes and had died in battle for a noble cause and just, had flung himself into battle without regard for whether he lived or died. And it had just become a mental habit, that life is there to be used and perhaps lost, but if the cause is noble, it doesn't matter. And of course, Master was a fighting general in a number of incarnations, and so was Swami Kriyananda. And if we've been with them, we very likely sacrificed our lives in a very different way. But it was just interesting to me because I don't, one feels, I feel that I don't have that much fear of death. Of course, when death comes in this lifetime, we'll find out. But I never associated it with dying in battle. It just never crossed my mind. For me, it was more like being in monasteries and perhaps being a physician, just many different things that brought me to death, but not throwing myself away in battle. But who knows? All that I'm saying is we have to surrender all of that. This is what Swami is saying. And and then in this letter, this whole section is suffering and death. He's talking to someone who has a very serious illness. So this is not an academic question. This is like, what are you going to do? And I think I've already talked about, but I'll just summarize it briefly in case I haven't. The woman in our community who had the name Happy Winningham, and she contracted AIDS very early in the AIDS cycle, when it was more or less a death. It was mostly a death sentence, although there were some treatments and so on. And she had the question to Swamiji, and because she'd had I think 2 different out-of-body death and return experiences, so her fear of death was non-existent. It was just she knew what happens when you die, because she'd done it twice, I think. Certainly once, and I think twice. But how hard should she try to live? And Swami says, as long as that body serves you and you feel you can continue to make spiritual progress in it, you should stay in it. So she made a great effort for, I think, actually 8 years. And Swami commented when she finally did pass, he said she grew a great deal during that time because it was a challenge, because the body was pulling to pull her mind down, and she had to constantly use her willpower to keep her attention focused on a higher plane. And that's wonderful training for us. That's why many things that look like tragedies, why did this terrible thing happen and that, we don't know from what perspective. It may just be the final opportunity for someone to overcome some great fear or attachment or last residual karmic debt that just has to be paid off. Even, and I can't speak to this because unfortunately I never had I never had an in-depth conversation with Swamiji about people who linger in the body but the mind is not working anymore. The only discussion I did have with Swamiji was in regard to one of Master's very close disciples, a woman named Kamala Silva. And she was a very advanced disciple of Master. She met him when she was just a teenager and was devoted to him her entire life. And in the 80s, she didn't live at Mount Washington. She wasn't a nun. Master actually sent her out to get married. He picked her husband, and so she lived as a married woman separately from the monastery. So at the end of her life, when her husband had died and her mind began to go, she didn't really have any context to take care of her. So for a period of time, she lived at Ananda village, and we took care of her. No, her husband was still living. I'm wrong about that. But he was in no position to care for her. But she was substantially mentally impaired. When I met her, she said, "Tell me your name. I'll immediately forget it, but at least introduce yourself." And she remembered that she was a disciple of Master, but nothing else in this world made much sense to her. She just couldn't. By the end of her life, she'd always been very devoted to animals, and she thought that her stuffed animals were living creatures, and she took care of them and loved them, and they comforted her, and she related to them. Eventually she was moved to some care facility, and the view out the window was just very dismal of the parking lot or something like that. She thought she was in the Himalayas. She thought the view out the window was just magnificent. She would tell everyone about the magnificent view. But it was all because her brain wasn't working anymore. So when I heard that she had lost her mind, and of course being a rather intellectually oriented person, it was a little disconcerting to me that she might lose her mind. And Swami said to me, "Oh, Asha, it's just her mind." Just like that. And I would think, but it's her mind. Now, you have to bear in mind, see, this is what's important. Your consciousness is not affected. Your intelligence is not affected. Your realization is not affected. None of it's affected. Your physical brain is broken. Just your physical brain, which means that you can't relate to the material plane. You don't know all the details of the material plane. One of my friends whose mother went in this direction, she would go and visit her, and once when she went to visit her, her mother said to her, "You're very nice. Do you belong to me?" And it was sort of sweet. "Yes, Mom, I'm your daughter." "Oh, isn't that lovely?" But she just couldn't put the pieces together because it's the brain that holds all of that. But her heart was open, and she could tell that this was a very nice lady, and she could receive all of that. So that's what Swami was trying to say to me. It's just her mind. And I thought that was preposterous until I met Kamala. And I realized that the only thing she was lacking was her mind. And because of that, all the details of personality and this world and position and all of it. It was just, she couldn't cognize any of it. But she remembered that she was a disciple of Master. And she remembered, the joy of his company and how much she loved him. I mean, that could have gone also, but it didn't. In fact, that's where she lived. That's why everything was so beautiful and so joyous to her. And everything, in the end, her husband put her in a facility that was not all that uplifting, and she was completely content. She thought it was wonderful because she was living in a state of bliss, because it was just her brain that was broken. Now, I never talked beyond that brief conversation with Swami about what it really is when people go into these states. My father spent the last 2 years of his life, I think he must have had some kind of a stroke or something, because he sort of lost a lot of mental facility kind of all at once, almost like in a matter of a day or two. But I'm not really sure. It didn't really make any difference. My mother had been ill for a very long time, and my feeling was my father, in fact, it was true, my father just needed a break. And so he just went on a holiday. He went on a mental holiday. And he was a Virgo, and he was always very exact about things, and he tended to worry. And it was so dear. When his brain stopped working, he forgot that he was supposed to be worried. And he just became very happy. He was a very sweet man, very kind, very sweet man, very egalitarian in his accepting of people. He had many very nice qualities. But he was a bit Virgo. He was a bit exact about things, and he would worry. But he just lost all of it and just became all of that and just became a very happy, accepting, appreciative person. I wouldn't have wanted him to miss that phase. Was he making spiritual progress? Was he learning that he really didn't have to worry, that he could just be sweet and accepting and that would be good enough? I can't answer those questions, but it's interesting to me. Or even in opposite directions, I know of a case. Well, this has been suggested to me, and I can't say that I've studied it scientifically, but when people lose their mental capacities, they often go in whatever direction they were already going. And I don't think that's always true. But there's a recent case that I know of where someone's mother has recently become notably mentally unbalanced. But what's so interesting is the way she's gone unbalanced is just an exaggerated version of who she's always been. In other words, we get the final fruit of a lifetime of decisions. And do we then get to see the unfortunate or fortunate consequences? In this case, it's the unfortunate consequences. The unfortunate consequences of that way of going at life without appreciation, with lots of criticism, with lots of fear, and it just becomes exaggerated because the brain can't operate normally anymore? These are all very interesting questions, aren't they? And Swami says we have to prepare for this. So here she is, this woman to whom he's writing, I think it's a woman. What happens is that the more you not only step out of the way mentally, but offer your ever thought, feeling, and action to God, the more you feel increasingly blessed by an ever stronger flow of His love, joy, and inspiration pouring through you. Let's not wait for a terminal illness, okay? Wouldn't that be a good idea? Wouldn't it be better just to start now? Swami calls death the final exam. So do we want to just try to cram in the last week? Or do we want to just study a little bit every day so that when the exam comes, we'll just sail through it? Then he says, as Jesus says, you must lose your life in God to find true life. Lose yourself to find your true self. The supreme incentive for doing so is that in clinging to the little self, one clings to limitation, suffering, and misery. So, this person has a serious illness. Swami says, just surrender to it. You know, don't think of your body as its own. It is God's body from which at least the consciousness of illness must be banished. See, the consciousness of illness is that there's something wrong, and that, I'm inhibited now. I can't be myself because my body's not working. Think always of becoming a Jivan Mukta, of letting go of the whole of it. And why not now? Why not now? So let's go on to the next one. This is one of the most wonderful sections in this book, because Swami's just having to go right to the end of the story. This letter was written in 1972, and it says, "Bliss is the answer to suffering. Thank you for your sweet, touching letter. It is good to have a heart soft enough to feel the sufferings of others. But now ask yourself, does God suffer? His nature is pure bliss. Is he then callous and unfeeling toward human suffering? Is he perhaps unaware that people suffer?" Swami, there's a different place where Swami was talking about a conversation with Master, and there was some theologian who was trying to argue that, God doesn't know suffering or doesn't recognize suffering or something. And Master replied, well, God would be pretty stupid if he didn't. It's all around us. Of course God recognizes. The divine power, it's not like anything is separated from the divine consciousness. Is God perhaps unaware that people suffer? Don't you see, Swami writes, bliss is the answer to suffering, not merely something we feel when suffering has been temporarily forgotten. It is not by jumping into the water and drowning with the drowning man that we help him, but by standing on dry ground and rescuing him, or by swimming if we are strong enough, but certainly not by voluntarily drowning too. So what this person must have written is just how miserable they are because so many people in the world are miserable. Which, given the times we live in, this is now middle of September in 2021, the prospect of human suffering is pretty much in front of us. Not in my daily life in the world that I live in, except just occasional people that you see wandering on the street. But in the world, a few weeks ago, the United States ended 20 years of involvement in the war in Afghanistan and pulled all our troops out. And it devolved very quickly into chaos, and the oppositional force, the Taliban, just moved in and took over most of the country. And there is tremendous concern about what kind of a regime that group will now set up, and what it will mean for the women of that country. And also, there have been thousands of people over 20 years who have really helped the United States, worked with the United States as translators and various other things, who now may be targeted by that regime and may either be killed or suffer greatly in their families. So there has been, and I'm not quite sure where state it's in now, but there was this extraordinary effort to get of people trying to escape from that country, and then the part of the USA to try to get out as many people who had become dependent on us and whose welfare might now really be threatened. I have to say I'm not completely informed as to how it is in the moment on September 14th of this year. But it was, for some reason, it really ripped my heart up to hear and see all of that and to just contemplate it. I try to stay out of the bad news which permeates our planet without being totally uninformed, because it's important, at least I think it's important to have some idea of what's going on. I have to make decisions. I have to respond to other people's concerns. I have friends all over the world, and so I can't just pretend not to know. But it's very challenging. And whatever this woman, I presume, whoever it is written, is talking about, just becomes heartbreaking. And also becomes, is it even right to just go about my life and be happy? If all of these people are suffering so much, how do I have the right to be comfortable and just go on with my life? And so it's a very real question, because it strikes at the heart of the matter. So Swami's saying that bliss is the antidote to suffering, is the answer to suffering. He's really trying to say that what is the opposite of this? And he's not saying happy is the antidote to suffering, because that's just too fatuous. Yes, of course, when you're not suffering, you're happy. But he's actually saying it's the solution. Because, and this is all the things that we've been talking about all the way through, we identify deeply with the details of our personality and our time here, and we lose track of the longer rhythm. We lose track of ourselves as divine beings and God's will playing through us. Now that doesn't mean that awful things don't still happen. And it is not divine to just be glib or dismissive, or, just because you lost your home and several members of your family died, you should just be detached. I mean, that's cruel. But when that kind of darkness comes, Swamiji had a brilliant statement, which is very deep to feel. He said, that's the kind of suffering that brings people to God. And it brings people to God because we have clung to this world and we have believed that we will find our fulfillment and our happiness in this world. And we have to keep trying to find our happiness in this world until we understand that it's never going to work. That we're not made that way. The way the human being is made is that our fulfillment comes when we're in tune with the divine. And these are hard lessons. This is not like something that we can resolve here. And I have to say, I'm just beginning to understand how this really works. I read something in just one of the, some internet thing that came to me. This is a statement that is purported to be from an American Indian chief. I say that because I just presume it is. A Native American, one of the indigenous tribes, a leader of one of those indigenous tribes, modern. This isn't an ancient prophecy, this is in the present. And I can't use the exact words that he used, but here's the sense of what I understood. He said the world at the moment, right now, is that there's a break in the, you might even just say, in the fabric of the material plane. There's an opening now. And of course, in the last few weeks, the section of this book just before this one was all of Master's prophecies about all the difficult things that are going to happen. So the idea of really bad things happening on this planet is right there. And so when I, at a great distance, hear about the difficulties all these people are having in Afghanistan and the karma of the USA if we don't keep our promises to the people who helped us. And there are all kinds of exceedingly distressing backstories of how that effort has not been carried out. There's not very good karma for the country that I live in, and that's very painful. And these people are really going to suffer. And all of this affected my consciousness very profoundly. And I know enough to know that I may have to face much worse. And how am I going to be useful to anyone if the sight of suffering just causes me to lose my connection with the divine power? So I'm thinking about this very deeply now. Let me think where I was going with this. Give me just a moment. Oh yes, this American Indian. And he said there's a break and it's an opening. And he said, we're all going to have to go through that opening, but it's just an opening. And let's say exactly, as we step through it, he said, it's either a doorway to higher consciousness or it's a pit into which we can fall. And it's the same opening. But because it's an opening in the material plane rather than an opening into the material plane, it's an opening from where we stand, and we either step through it and fall into the pit, or we step through it, and as we go through it, we move ever more powerfully into the light. And he said exactly in the same way. He said the way to respond to suffering is with greater and greater joy. And not joy because they're suffering, but because it drives us to find something behind that suffering, instead of just falling into the pit of whatever that suffering might be. And he was saying it's not wrong to celebrate whatever, if your life is flowing beautifully, it's not wrong to celebrate that. And then he goes on to say, what each of us must do at a time like this is to create as much joy as we can create and to disperse it as widely as we can in the world of everyone that we touch. And now he's not talking about drunken revelry. He's not talking about just sort of foolish outward activity like that. He means deeply within ourselves. Just feel that loving power and presence of the divine even in the midst of it. This was Betsy Ten Boom's instruction to her sister Corrie. The Ten Boom sisters were in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, and Holland is where they lived. And they were arrested because they became a center of the underground in Amsterdam where they lived. And they had many Jewish people living in their home, hidden in their home, and they were a conduit for getting people to be safe, and they eventually were found out. And they were arrested. Betsy, the older sister, died in the concentration camp. Corrie lived. Betsy said to Corrie, I will die, you will live. After this is over, you will go around the world telling people that no sorrow and no suffering in the world, no matter how deep the pit of suffering into which a person falls, the love of Jesus is deeper still. And she said, and they will believe you because you've been here. And that is about as deep a suffering as you can imagine. But Betsy prayed, she was telling Corrie, also, and you will have homes to help people recover, and all the things that actually came to be. And Betsy talked about, you will have to help the people who've been hurt by this. And Corey assumed she meant the prisoners, but she realized that Betsy was talking about the guards, and that the ones who really were going to suffer afterwards were the ones who had perpetrated this. And in fact, and Corey just thought that the whole idea that she would have to compassionately help these sadistic, cruel people, it was unthinkable to her. But Betsy promised her she would have to do it, and in fact she did, because they were so broken by the experience. Because no matter how deep the pit, the love of God is deeper still. And those are just words until something happens in your own life. And then you discover that it's true. And that's where bliss is actually the answer to the suffering. And so we don't help other people by feeling obligated to go down into despair. We help people by being able to hold on to that power in the presence of God, no matter what the challenge. But when I asked Swami this question, basically how to do it, he said, you have to practice when it's easier. Which is, we can't just wait for the great moment. We have to be every day. Because it's a constant battle in just our everyday life. There's always that force that's coming in to tell you that you're justified in letting your consciousness drop. You're justified in being angry. We're justified in being sad. This time I really am the victim. And then we have to work our way through it. We have to work our way sincerely through it. You can't just paste on an affirmation. You know, it's not suppressing. It's actually realizing. It has to be realization. And there's lots of middle stages where we oscillate, but we have to practice when it's easier. In fact, when Swamiji was giving a series of classes around Northern California or wherever he was, they were called Building Spiritual Power Against Troubled Times. He gave a whole series of lectures. They might be in a transcribed book, or maybe it's coming out as a book. And somewhere, I bet, if you contact Treasures Along the Path, which is a department of ananda.org, I think they have the recordings. But one of the things Swami said was, and this was in the 80s that he gave these classes, he said, you must develop a deep spiritual practice now, because the time will come when otherwise you will be, well, I'm hesitating to say what he said. Here's what he said. Otherwise you will go mad with fear. That's exactly what he said. Unless you have a deeply established spiritual path. So, it's quite sobering, isn't it? So, let's go on. So now I'm going to talk about joy again. So he says, suffering is a result of delusion, not of outward circumstances. Ooh, that's really something, isn't it? Suffering is a result of delusion, not of outward circumstances. There have been people in the darkest dungeons. Benvenuti Cellini was a good example, as he relates in his interesting autobiography. And people suffering from the worst diseases. Consider Ramakrishna, Saint Teresa of Avila, and countless others who have known only joy. Now, these are very challenging examples. When Ramakrishna was on his deathbed, and he had throat cancer, he was taking a lot of the karma of his disciples and using his body to help free them. And so he had cancer of the throat, which I can only imagine is terribly painful. And one of his disciples was visiting him, and Ramakrishna was, was well advanced in the disease. And Ramakrishna was a very unpredictable and unusual character. And he was telling sometimes Ramakrishna would become just like a little child. about how painful it was and how he couldn't eat, and even to swallow was so difficult, and the pain was just so awful, just like a little child would complain. And he was complaining and complaining. And the more he spoke, the disciple just entered into a higher and higher exalted state of pure bliss. And it just, the more Ramakrishna poured out his suffering, the more blissful the disciple felt. And finally Ramakrishna just smiled at him, and the disciple said, Ramakrishna said to the disciple, "Oh, you found out my secret, haven't you?" Just like that. Like, yeah, I appear to be suffering, but I'm not suffering at all. You know, I'm in a state of bliss because this is just the body and I've surrendered it to God. You can do whatever you want with it. Saint Teresa of Avila, too, she was ill so much of the time, but her body was ill, but her spirit was completely free. I mean, it's just impossible for us to think about that, isn't it? There's remarkable stories even from the time of the Second World War in concentration camps. I remember reading one book where they talked about this one man who everybody was starving and emaciated and weak, and they just were having so much difficulty. And he was in exactly the same circumstances, with no more physical comfort or care than anyone else. He remained robust and energetic. And he was just constantly giving in the midst of it. And even his physical body was completely different. I wish I knew the exact story where I read that, but it was one of the, it was very reputable. It wasn't just somebody saying it could happen. Is it in Viktor Frankl's book, perhaps Man's Search for Meaning? Just where this man's consciousness was so different that even his physical body manifested differently. It's a powerful thing to meditate on. Suffering is a result of delusion, not of outward circumstance. There have been people in the darkest dungeons, all I was reading through there. There have been people living in palaces, surrounding by wealth, fame, and all the goods of this world, whose suffering was constant because in their minds they knew no peace, were selfish, and did not care for others. One of the other comments from Betsy Ten Boom, from her experiences in prison when they were first arrested in Amsterdam and wherever they were in prison, she said, no, excuse me, this is a different book I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of The Pastor's Wife, which is the story of Sabina Wurmbrand. Richard Wurmbrand was a Christian, he was a Jew by birth who converted to Christianity, and he lived in Romania. So first he got to be persecuted by the Nazis as a Jew, and then after the war was over, he was persecuted by the Romanian communists because he was a Christian. And his wife, Sabina, was eventually swept up and sent to prison too. He spent 12 years or something in prison. She was in prison for less. Richard Wurmbrand wrote a book with the title Tortured for Christ, and a few other very, very good books. He was a great man. We had the privilege of meeting him. He came when we lived at Ananda Village. When I was living at Ananda Village, he came and he was sponsored by eventually he was ransomed out of the communist prison from the West. He was a well-known figure, and he was ransomed out to the West. And then he went around speaking at churches and so on. He spoke at the local church in Grass Valley, and like 50 of us from Ananda went to see him at this fundamentalist Christian church that was sponsoring him. It was actually quite interesting because they had an unusual physical arrangement where there was kind of a podium or a platform, a dais where you could speak from, and it was between two rooms, so you could speak into the sanctuary or you could speak into the fellowship hall. But there were so many people because of all of us who came, so all of the Christians from that church were in the sanctuary, and all of the Ananda people with Swamiji were in the fellowship hall. And Wormbrand would speak to this side, and then he would turn and speak to this side, and then he would turn and speak to this side. And his theology was very fundamental Christian, but his realization was beyond all of it. So he would speak he would speak what these people expected to hear on this side, and then he would turn and speak what we expected to hear on the other side. He was just absolutely wonderful, and his wife was there too. She was lovely too. I mean, he's just like, he'd been through all of this, but he had emerged triumphant rather than broken. It was amazing to see him. So anyway, Sabina wrote this book, and she said that not only, all kinds of people were being arrested because the communists were chaotic in what they were doing. And so many wealthy people were also arrested. And she said in the women's prison, there were these groups of socialite women who, for one reason or another, who knows, were arrested and imprisoned in the clothes they were wearing. So often here they were in prison, and they'd been arrested when they were out to dinner and they were in evening gowns or whatever it was. She said all of them were suffering because the conditions were horrid. But she said the ones who suffered the most were the socialites because they had no inner life. She said her body suffered, the conditions were awful. She was worried about her son, who was only 12 when she was arrested, and now both his parents were in prison. As it happened, he was very precocious, and he found people to take care of him, and I mean, as well as he could, he made through. But she said, but I had a relationship with Jesus. I had a deep inner world that I was part of. And she said, all of us in prison who had already, made that deep inner contact, we had a place to live. We had a place to be. She said the socialites had nothing. She said, and their misery was so far beyond in the same conditions, because without clothes and parties and hairdos and makeup, they had no life. And once that was gone, it was a complete emptiness. This is what Swami is saying. Don't count on the fact that this world is just going to continue as you want it to, and you're going to be able to be supported in all these ways, even our own bodies. I mean, we don't need a cataclysmic world event. People, their bodies betray them, and that's how it feels. You get some terminal disfiguring illness, or just an acquaintance, person who runs a shop in this area that I've been going to see for a very long time. Maybe she's 50 with a child who's probably at the most 20 at this point. Her husband just became ill and died. And of course, with the COVID pandemic, lots of people, just everything, I have it all organized except I don't, because Divine Mother is running the show, not us. So we have to make a deep decision. And so Swami is saying, there have been people living in palaces surrounded by wealth who have no peace. They say that there's many more suicides among the wealthy. Every so often the world is shocked by someone that we think had it all, but in fact they don't. They have it all and they don't have anything, so they have nothing to hope for, and they die by their own hand. Joy and suffering depend entirely on attitudes of the mind. The poorest beggar has found bliss when his attitude was right. The richest king has found only misery when his attitude was wrong. Cellini actually prayed for the grace to be thrown into a dungeon again. So much joy did he find there because his mind was on God. And he was a worldly man, not a saint. People also found God in concentration camps. Just what I was talking about. Just a moment, I was trying to find a thought there. Oh, when I first went to India for the first time, and then repeatedly because we would take these pilgrimage trips. I was one of the leaders of this group, and we would take 30 or so almost always Americans, on a trip through India. This was from like 1987 to 2006, I think, is actually over a 20-year period, 86 to 2006. And we would always go the same route to places that were significant in Yogananda's life and in Autobiography of a Yogi. And one of the places we would go would be Varanasi, because that's where Lahiri Mahashaya lived. That's where Babaji and Mataji had their conversation about Babaji keeping his physical body till the end of this cycle of creation. And there at Dasa Samvidgat by the Ganges, and Varanasi is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, and is considered to be the most holy city in India. Anyway, just many things that were wonderful. I'm told that in more recent years, because I haven't been there since 2006, but in more recent years, the Prime Minister, the leaders, certain leaders of India are from that area and have really cleaned up that city a great deal. So perhaps, God willing, when we ever go back to India again, I'll be able to go there. But one of the places we'd go into the old city through the very narrow lanes and so on. And you would sort of enter into the old city at a certain point. And the first time we were there, and every time after, or at least for a number of years, there was a beggar there. And that beggar was in very bad condition. I don't know whether he was missing his legs or whether they were just completely crippled. I believe he had the use of his arms. And in the context, he had a little, just like a wheeled platform, like a skateboard, only a little bigger than that. And for some reason, I think he would lie on his back. Maybe it was the way his body was twisted, I don't know. And I think he would use his arms to propel. So he was there, and he was like 6 inches off the ground, or not much more than that. He would be below your knees. And he stationed himself at a certain entryway into the old city. And since we tended to follow the same route, other people would lead me. I don't have a good sense of geography. We would see him. And his condition was shocking, especially for those Americans who'd never been to India or never been to any country except Western, advanced, economically prosperous countries. And his condition was about as extreme as you can imagine, and he made his living by begging there. He had the most blissful countenance. He just, whatever karma he was facing, and it was whatever it was dramatic and it was tough, he had simply transcended it. And he just had this unmistakable aura about him. It was, and we all felt it. We all talked about it. And then over the years, we would see him again, and it was sort of a joke because you were so delighted to see him and so happy for him that you would forget to give him money. And I mean, he needed money because that was what he needed to live. But whatever he needed, he had it. And it just made you really think differently. I mean, it's one thing you can sort of project certain thought, but what was so interesting is that we all felt it. Everyone got to know him. I never got to know him personally. We didn't have any shared language or anything like that. But wow, whenever I think about difficult circumstances, I think about him. Now just think about this. If you actually have gone so deep into karma, reincarnation, God's love, the divine rightness of everything that happens, the surrender of my life into God's hands, the determination to become a Jivan Mukta, how could any circumstance be outside of the will of God? And how could any circumstance be something that you don't want? Now, of course, common sense kicks in, and we fight for the likes and dislikes of our heart. But all those likes and dislikes, what are they based on? They're based on, I want comfort and I want ease. And all of Western culture is based on comfort and ease. But spiritual realization is based on something completely other, which is, I want to surrender all limiting conditions and be free. So Swami says, suffering is a result of delusion, not of outward circumstances. Worth remembering. Joy and suffering depend entirely on attitudes of the mind. Now, we can't get there today, but we don't want to quit until we get there. So the more we feel of people suffering, the more we should give them, or at least long to give them, the healing touch of joy, and not only join them in their suffering. This is true Christ-like compassion. And this is exactly what that American Indian says. It's not wrong to experience joy. This is an opening in the fabric of the cosmos, inviting us to greater and greater joy. And the joy all the greater if it's in the face of challenging circumstances. And what do we really want to give people who are suffering? We want to give them joy. That's what the antidote is. We can't change circumstances. Circumstances may be beyond our powers to change because God Himself may be sending them. It may be necessary karma. Here's an interesting story that I was reading in Swami's book, Visit to Saints of India. And he talked about this girl that he met there, this saintly girl. At the age of 9, she told her parents, I'm going into my room now. Please leave food outside the door. She went into seclusion at the age of 9, and her parents supported her in that. And they would leave a meal outside, and she would take the meal. She just never came out of her room. She gradually, her reputation for saintliness became very well known, and everyone in the village would send her requests for prayers. And invariably, when she would pray for someone, they would be healed. Her own father was invalided. Whatever was wrong with him, he was an invalid. And as the years passed, when her capacity to heal became well known, the family started asking her to heal her father. And she said, it's not right that I should do that. And then they just kept after her, and then they thought, you're refusing to do it because you don't want to show favoritism to your own family, but you should. He's your father. It's not right. She said, I should not heal him. It's not right that I should heal him. Finally, they insisted, and she said, all right, I'll do it because you've insisted, but you'll see. So she prayed for him. He was healed. He became strong. And he immediately began to live a very dissolute life. He had been protected from his own bad inclinations by being ill. And he was in the process of expiating the bad karma that drew him to a dissolute life. But because all of them insisted, she made him strong again. And then he started the whole karmic cycle all over again. So who's to say? You know, we don't know what's really happening. That's why we have to be really strong in our faith in God. Swami said he met that girl. She even came out of her room to meet him. And by that time she was in her late teens, 18, 19, 20. She never developed. She never had puberty. She was so pure and so light in her consciousness. She was still like a young girl, even though she was almost 20. Soon after Swami saw her, she was heard or seen to be weeping in front of the statue of Krishna, and the next day she was dead. She just had left her body. Just a very short, very unusual incarnation that went through. But she knew that relieving suffering was not the first priority of God. The priority of God is to remove delusion. So, a lot for us to think about, isn't it? God bless you, my friend.